Hi everyone. I don't know if you can see this, but this is how I'm connected to the projector. So it's 2017. We are landing rockets after they go to space, and we still have to use these dongle trains to connect new laptops to projectors. So my name is Miguel. I'm here to present Swagger as a single source of truth for REST APIs. First, just a little bit about me. For those of you that don't know me, I see a few friendly faces. So my recent path, recently I finished a PhD in the University Institute of Lisbon, where I was developing techniques or artificial intelligence techniques for swarms of robots. So that was very fun and challenging. Fun now that I look back, because at the time it wasn't really fun. So after I finished my PhD, I decided to come back into the industry, and I applied to TopTal, where I was accepted, and I've been working for roughly 1 year at TopTal. And more recently, one of my clients that I got through TopTal invited me to be part of their company. So TopTal has this provision where if a client wants to keep you for a long time, they can pay a fee, they can keep you as an employee. That's what happened. I'm the CTO of HomeMD. We are a company based in Toronto, Canada. We're developing a new, what we call an EMR, which is basically a medical system. So it's a system to basically manage a patient's health records, manage appointments, and so on. So it's a healthcare company. We are still in stealth stage, so there's not really much about us. We intend on launching in roughly 1 month. So we are opening up a clinic in Canada. We are going to be using our own software and improving it, and then maybe in the future we can either provide the software as a service, or we can expand the clinics and so on. So what I'm going to talk about today came from this work and how I basically created this system from scratch, and I had this need of creating an API. And so before I actually dig into the details, I just want to kind of talk about the title a little bit. It's a little confusing. Swagger as a single source of truth for REST APIs. So maybe I'm just going to focus on these 3 things first as an introduction. Let's start with REST APIs. I'm pretty sure almost everyone here knows what a REST API is, so I'm not going to spend too much time. But it's basically a type of API that uses HTTP as the underlying protocol. Usually, we can use these verbs or these HTTP methods to make requests. There are more HTTP verbs, but these are the ones we mostly use. And they allow us to get data, to put data in some sort of data store, update, delete, and so on. These types of APIs are stateless, and that means that the backend doesn't really store any session data. If you ever programmed in PHP, you know that there's this concept of a session, and you have a cookie which tracks the session ID, and somehow the backend is keeping track of what the user is doing. Here, each request is independent. You can make multiple requests at the same time from the same user, and they are treated as independent entities. And another thing about REST API is that there's this uniform interface. And the idea is that the URL that you are calling basically identifies a resource. And then you can manipulate these resources via a representation. What this means is that what you get from the endpoint might not be exactly how the resource looks like, for instance, in a database. It can be, for instance, you can get JSON data or XML data, but they are still representing the same resource. So you get these representations back, and then you can modify those representations locally in the client and send them back to the server. Some alternatives that you might have used in the past, WSDL and SOAP. I'd rather not talk too much about them because they give me nightmares, so I'm just move on. So just as an example, these are 4 kinds of requests that we could make if we had like a book API. And you can make a GET request for /books, and that would give you all the books. But then if you identify a specific book, and this would be the ID of the book, you'd get only that resource. Then you could send some data, for instance, adding a new book using a POST request, or you could delete a book by identifying the resource and then sending a GET request, delete request, sorry. So the other part of the title, Swagger, using Swagger for REST APIs. So has anyone here used Swagger before? Okay, nice. So when I started the development for this project, at the beginning I wasn't going to use any framework, but then I started thinking I'm going to have to write the documentation manually. It's going to be really bad. It's going to be outdated. So I started looking for solutions, and there are some. Swagger is one of them. They title themselves as the world's most popular API tooling. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but it's very popular. And the idea behind Swagger is that it's basically a specification and a number of tools that help you design an API and implement it. So the way it works is that you design your API through this spec file, this specification, which is a YAML file. For those that haven't used YAML, it's just it's not really a markup. Well, they don't like to be called a markup language, but it's kind of a markup language similar to JSON, but I would say that it's simpler. Doesn't have all curly braces in every line. But the idea is that you write down this file, and then your documentation is always up to date and in sync with the code. So actually, the file that you write ends up integrating with your code and generating the documentation for your API. And this leads to transparency. At least that's what I found in my case. It leads to transparency across teams, because if they check the documentation, they know that that's the most accurate version of the API, because you start from this file. And then there's a very active community, so there's loads of tools to do lots of things. They integrate with 40 languages or something like that. So there's a lot of work done for you and can really save you a bunch of time. So what I'm going to show you now is two tools that they provide on their website. The first one is Swagger UI, and let's see if this opens in the right place. Okay, so this is a link you can find on Swagger's website. And this is what the documentation that's generated by Swagger looks like. So this is for a pet store. And the idea is that you have all your endpoints color-coded by method or verb. You can see, for instance, for this one, this is to add a new pet. It's a post request /pet. And then you can see what it expects in terms of data. So you can see that it expects an ID, a category, a name, photo URLs, and so on. Not only that, you can see that it expects this data in JSON. You could maybe see what it's expecting in terms of XML, because this is a REST API. You can actually send different types of data. You can also see the model. So this endpoint actually expects a pet, and that's a model that's defined, has a category and the name, the same thing that we send in the body of the post request. Okay? Then you have the types of responses. You can always get a 200 responses if everything went fine. But in terms of errors, if you give an invalid input, you'll know that the server will return 4 or 5. So this is very handy. You can even try it out here. So you can modify this data and then execute, and it will send to the server and give you the response. It worked 200, and this is the response. Gives you the headers and so on. So this is the documentation that's generated for you. You don't have to do anything. And the other teams, the other developers can just take a look at it. And then in the end, you also have here the description of all the data models. Okay. So let's go here. So the other tool is particularly nice for someone that's starting, and it's the Swagger editor. So on the right-hand side, you can see the same thing as I was showing you before, but on the left-hand side, you can see the actual Swagger spec. And this is what you write. And this file here is generating in real time the API on the right-hand side. So for instance, this is pet, no, not here. So this part is just a basic description of your API, but then over here when you get to paths, you can start editing the endpoints themselves. And here, for instance, add a new pet to the store. It's the same text as here. So if you delete something, it should update in real time. And if you make a mistake, it will give you an error because it cannot really parse it. So for someone that's just getting started in Swagger, this is really helpful because you can write one line and see what happens. You can copy-paste endpoints and modify them. And the way, so just going over the basic structure of defining endpoints, you just have to say what's the path, what's the method. If there are some tags, the tags will then group the endpoint. So here is one tag is pet, and all of these endpoints are under pet, and there's a tag that's stored, and so on. You can specify what kind of data it receives, what kind of data it responds with. And then you have the parameters. For instance, this endpoint is expecting a pet object, and it's going in the request body. So this is all very nice. In the end, you also have the models. So for instance, if I change the model here, it will apply to all the endpoints. If I just change, for instance, the name, instead of being name, it's dog_name, just updates everywhere. Okay. One thing that I should say about Swagger Editor is that it works really well with 700 lines of code, but when you have 2,000, 3,000, every character you type, it's going to parse the whole file, and it starts getting quite slow. So I would use it just to learn, and then you just move to your IDE, and you don't need it to basically parse every time you write something. Okay. So we talked about REST API, we talked about Swagger. Now the other part of the title, which is a single source of truth. What the hell do I mean by this? So according to Wikipedia, single source of truth is the practice of structuring information models such that every data element is stored exactly once. And this is basically in line with this concept that you usually, as programmers, have, is don't you repeat yourself, right? You don't want to repeat code, you don't want to repeat data models, you don't want to repeat stuff. So my idea is to basically use the Swagger spec, since it's the base for the API, let's use it as the base for everything. And it's outlined roughly here. So the Swagger spec is a source of truth. And every change you make to models and endpoints, they start on the spec and they propagate throughout your code base. Database, backend, client side, everything. The fact that the spec also allows you to expand it enables even more automated features. So the Swagger spec is a bit restrictive in terms of some things, but you can always add stuff on top. So it's just metadata that you're adding to the file, and then you can parse it and do some cool things. For instance, if you're using an object relational mapping to access the database, you are not making, for instance, SQL queries directly, you're just going through a model. You can generate those models directly through the Swagger spec. You don't have to write the models in the spec and then write them. For instance, if you use MongoDB, you'd have to write them in Mongoose. You can also set endpoint permissions and fine-grained control permissions. You can do client-side encryption of data in the database. You can create the database indexes directly through the Swagger spec and whatever you actually need. One thing that I didn't mention about Swagger is that you can basically create clients for your API for a lot of languages. So for instance, if you are also developing a mobile application, you can just generate, for instance, a library in Swift and use that library to consume your API. So that's another way you can automate stuff. So now what I had in mind was just showing you how I actually do some of these things. It's not going to be very comprehensive, but just for you to have an idea of exactly what this entails. Okay, let's see if this screen. Okay. So here is my my spec file. It's roughly 5,000 lines long. Okay, so this already has some endpoints and some models. So in the beginning, I have all the tags so that I can group the documentation by tag. I specify a validation module. So basically, if there's an email field, it can be validated through this module or whatever field you want. So I also do validation on top of this. And then we get the paths. And for instance, let's see, get patient. Sorry. So here, for instance, so this endpoint is /patient/ID. Here you're supposed to provide the ID of the patient, and I define here all of the fields that start with X. They're stuff I'm adding on to the spec. I'm expanding the spec, and then I go look for these things in my code and try to automate from there. So in this case, I'm saying that I want the patient role, the physician role, and the admin role to have access to this endpoint. But if I just come here and I just delete this, suddenly the admin can no longer access the endpoint. So this is where the automation part starts kicking in, even though this is a very simple thing, permissions. And I think that even the Swagger spec really enables you to do permissions in a more native way. Then you have the parameters and so on, and the responses with the models. So this is very similar to what we've seen in the Swagger editor. It's just for my particular use case. So before I go here, I wanted to show you these two lines. First is X-Swagger router controller. This one identifies in which module of my app I can find this endpoint. And then this operation ID defines which function in that module is going to execute when we call this endpoint. So you're basically plugging in your code into the Swagger spec by defining where in the code it can find basically the controller for the API. So now we go patients. So this is the code that when you call that endpoint, it gets executed. It just gets routed automatically here. So you don't have to, for instance, I'm using Express as the web server. I don't know if you've ever used Express, but you can define the endpoints manually, just define /patient. But doing this for an API of this magnitude would be not very nice. So this just routes everything directly, and I can show you how that's routed. So here, this is the request that comes in, and there's some middleware that we can use that injects the metadata from Swagger into the request itself. So we can actually get the ID that's mapped on the endpoint itself directly. So we get the values based on what the spec says. So if in the spec I change ID to patient ID, then I would have to change it here. Then you can just do whatever validations you need to do and return some data. And if we go here to the application start, I can show exactly how many lines of code you need to make this happen. So first, you have to install this tool, which is Swagger Tools. It's an open source tool. And this is basically going to inject a lot of middleware into Express. The way Express works is that you can inject these middleware, which are basically functions, and they can work on the request when it comes in before it actually gets executed by the controller. So you call this function, which is Swagger Tools.initialize middleware, and then I'll skip some things. You can start plugging in individual components that you might or might not need. So, for instance, I plug in the Swagger UI middleware that comes with this tool, and this basically shows the documentation. If I remove this line, if I comment it, then we can no longer access the documentation through the API itself. Then you have the validator, which basically validates the request coming in before they even touch your code to see if the request is well formed. If you are expecting a patient and you get a physician, for instance, an object, then it's going to basically reject the request and give an error to the API user. And you don't have to do any validation at all. Then you can inject the metadata, which is the part that allows you to access the, for instance, in that other example, you can access by name. I can access here the ID because that's what it says in the spec. Then you can also inject some security middleware. In this case, I'm using a JWT authentication method, which is based on these JSON web tokens. And it basically means that when you log in, you get handed a token back, and then you use that token on every request on the header of the HTTP request. So here, it just validates that that token is valid, what kind of user it is it a physician, is it a patient, and if the authentication is not valid, it just rejects the response before it gets to your code. So you don't have to keep seeing if the user is logged in on every endpoint. It just does it for you. And then you have the router config, and this is what basically routes the, after you've done all these validations, it routes the request to the code that's actually your endpoint, which in this case for this particular get patient, it goes and looks for this patients module, which is this one, and the get patient function, which is this one. So these lines of code basically get all of the routing going. Another thing that I can show you, yes. So another thing that I can show you is the models. Not here, here. So here I keep referencing, for instance, these models, account information, patient, whatever, and they are defined in the end over here. So for instance, if we look at the patient model, you'll see some lines that start with X, and that's where I basically extend the Swagger spec. In my case, for the database, I'm using DynamoDB, which is a NoSQL offering by Amazon. And I'm using as my ORM library Dynamoose, which is very similar to Mongoose if you use it. For Mongoose, there is a tool which is called Swagger Mongoose that basically translates the models to the Mongoose models. For Dynamoose, there is none, so I basically ported the Swagger Mongoose library to my Swagger Dynamoose. So this, that's how all of these models are being converted to Dynamoose models, and then I can access the database that way. But more than that, I'm doing validation on some of the fields. For instance, I have some rules that the username has to be over 4 characters long and so on. So I just say that the name of the validator is username, and then I have somewhere in the code a function called username that just validates this. So if you want to change the rules for your validation, just go to that function and change it. Another thing I'm using is client-side encryption. So Dynamoose doesn't really offer a very simple way for you to encrypt database, and since this is a medical application, you kind of have to encrypt patient data. And what they recommend, there's a tool for Java, there is none for other libraries. What they recommend is that you do it on the client side. That means that when you are going to store data on the database, you encrypt it, and when you get data out of the database, you decrypt it. So all I have to do is mark this field as encrypt true, and then it becomes encrypted in the database, and all the requests are going to be encrypted and decrypted. One thing that I was actually working on yesterday was defining, let's see if I can find it here. Let's see if I find it more. Okay, here. So we have this appointment model, and I need to define some secondary indexes for my database. And of course, I was going to do it through Swagger. So I implemented this index property, and every field that I mark as an index will become immediately, as soon as I deploy, an index in the database. If I remove it, it will remove the index from the database. So it just becomes very easy to change your data model and actually make changes in the data that's being stored. So I guess that these are the main topics that I wanted to talk about in the front end, in the back end. Sorry, in the front end. Let's see where I have it. Just give me a second. Okay. Up, down, down, down. Okay, so in the front end, I am using React and Redux. We also have a mobile application, but this is for a web front end. And I don't know if you ever used Redux to manage your application state, but the way it roughly works is that you have an application store where you store all the relevant data for your app. And then the way you make changes to that store is that you dispatch actions. So you can make an action to change the name of a patient, for instance, and that will make the change and then update the store. You can always also use Redux to actually make the API calls and then update the store with the results, or you can just receive the information in your component and handle it directly. And there's a mechanism which is called a thunk that basically it's a function that dispatches a function, and that's how Redux handles calling a synchronous function, in this case an API request. And the way that I have it set up is that there's a library which basically integrates Redux with Swagger. So instead of having to handle endpoints and then change the endpoint when you change the API and so on, is that you can actually call the API through the tag. This is the tag that basically groups lots of endpoints together. And this is the same name as the function in my backend. So I had the getPatient function, for instance. I would just call getPatient here. So I do patient.getPatient. And then you just pass it on the data that the API expects, and it just maps it directly if it's in the path, or if it's in the body, or if it's a parameter after a question mark, for instance. And the nice thing is that you dispatch this action, and this makes the API call. And when the API call resolves, then it will either dispatch this action or this action. So you can expect a success or a fail and then do things differently if one thing happens or another thing happens. So you can, for instance, in your reducer, which is where you make the changes to the data store, you can look for these events, and if they come in, you just update the data store. Or if it's in a component and you expect the data directly in the component, you also can look for these, and if this comes back, then you can display an error message, for instance. So this kind of looks funky for those that have never used Redux. There's a lot of boilerplate in terms of defining all of these actions. But there are also ways to generate standard JavaScript libraries for Swagger so that you don't have to do it like this. It's much simpler. But this is just a way of integrating in Redux. OK. So we're almost done. So what are some of the challenges associated with this? So this has to be a conscious choice that you're going to put everything on your Swagger spec, because you're just going to put so much metadata on top, and you're relying on that if suddenly you have to switch out of Swagger, you just have all this automation that was going to happen, and you're going to freak out because you're going to have to implement this all over again. So the more you rely on it, the harder it is to then go back. So that's a consideration you have to take. And then the Swagger protocol that I'm using, it's 2.0. It's a bit restrictive. It's not restrictive in the sense that you can't add metadata. You can add a lot of metadata to it. But the things that are set, for instance, the way you describe a path or the way you describe a model, you can't really change those. And you have to play by their rules. So these are just some of the things that I come across. You cannot, for instance, receive a single string in the body of a request. It has to be an object. It has to start, if it's a JSON object, it has to start with curly braces. It cannot be just a string. If you want to receive 2 files in a form upload, you cannot receive 2 files. And the security definitions, they are made for just 2 types, which are OAuth and basic authentication. I didn't want any of those. I just wanted JWT, which is quite widespread. And you have to basically hack the spec in order to use it, which is why I'm not using the native permission control. So just to finalize, I think that Swagger is really a great framework for REST APIs because it just saves you a lot of work, especially if you have a small team and you just have to do so many things at the same time. This will just make it so much easier for you. And those things that you usually don't really pay much attention, like documentation, you have to do it because that's how you create a Swagger spec, right? And your teammates will really thank you for that. The fact that it's expandable allows you to just keep adding metadata, and that allows you to automate even more. So you just write a new module that reads to some particular metadata and adds indexes in the database, for instance. And then there's this trade-off between magical code and explicit code. I don't know if this is the right way to express this, but there's this thing which I call NPM-driven development. I don't know if that's a thing. It's where you just npm install the universe and then your app has all the features, right? And you just call these libraries. And that's not really something you really want. So there's this trade-off between offloading your complexity to these third-party libraries that you don't have so much control over. And on the other spectrum, you have the way where you just do it yourself manually. So we can't really do one or the other. We have to find a balance. There are pros and cons to the 2 approaches. So it's just finding the right balance between things you just hand off to other libraries and things you do yourself. And of course, there are alternatives to Swagger. I've never used any of these, but I'm aware that they exist. So maybe they are better, maybe they are worse. Maybe some of you have opinions. I would be happy to hear them. And that's it. I thank you very much for listening. And I'm open for questions.
I've got a question. So you automated route generation on your backend with using the Swagger spec to do so. So have you any idea what's the performance impact of that? Is it all front-loaded in the boot of the application, or is it at runtime and it's cached afterwards? Do you have extra time to spin up the application?
There is a lot of overhead, not in the routing, but in my case, in processing the Swagger spec to generate the Dynamus models. Okay. So I know that it takes a little bit of time. I don't know how much the routing impacts. I think it's minimal.
It's not routing in particular. So you say you have a penalty. Is that front-loaded when you boot up the application, so your deployment will take a bit longer? Or does that happen afterwards while you're running? That can be an issue. I've
never measured. I'm not at the stage where I've done a lot of testing to see if things are running slowly or not. We're still in the developing features. But that's one thing that it would be probably interesting to take a look at. But I think that compared to, for instance, a call to a database, that overhead will be minimal. And there is some processing that goes on when we start the app. But my app takes like 3 seconds to start up, so I don't think it's a lot. Because it's doing a lot of generation of the models and checking with the database and seeing if the model is updated with the database and so forth.
So it's a schema sync as well. So
it's a what, sir?
A schema sync.
Yes.
Yes. So that makes sense. It takes a lot.
Yes, but I don't know exactly how much it takes to route, because I would guess I would have to fork the library and try to see how fast it runs certain parts.
Yeah. Just want to know if you had a comparison.
No, I haven't done that yet.
You had started without Swagger and then implemented the first few methods and noticed the difference.
Yeah, that's a possibility, but I haven't looked into it.
The other question is this: doesn't it make your development slightly more difficult, since there's no code before runtime? There's nothing to help you figure out which methods in the IDE, obviously, which methods are available to call in your API. You have to kind of rely on copy pasting from the spec to your code.
So actually, Swagger has a tool which is Swagger CodeGen, and it allows you to create a skeleton of your API just by reading the spec. It's nice for the first time you write some endpoints, but then afterwards you don't really use it. You just kind of keep adding new endpoints, and you add it in the spec and add it in the code.
Yeah, that's my experience as well. It's CodeGen. It's great to start, and it looks like a neat demo, but in production and when you're actually working, and
you don't use it anymore.
It has a lot of conflicts, and it's not really.
Unless you want to use it to generate these client-side libraries, in which case that will be part of your build process. You just generate a new library for your mobile app to use, for instance.
Okay. Yes, of course, it makes sense. That's really not the niche there. So you can just even build it as a library and keep in a repository somewhere. Thanks.
Thanks.
I never used Express, but from my understanding, you are generating the routes when you start up the application?
Yes.
Any reason to not prepare them while you are building the code or before you try to run it? I guess it's like a file with some matches or something, most frameworks.
I think they generate it on the fly based on the spec. So I guess they just dynamically create objects or something like that with the endpoints as parameters. It's very nice for it to generate every time, because while you're developing, you can add a new endpoint and it reloads the application because the file has changed, and it just loads the new thing without you having to go through a build process. Because this is more of a scripting language, right? JavaScript, you don't have this concept of build and then run. You make changes and then it runs with the most up-to-date version. So it speeds up the development a lot in that sense. And it basically restarts the application every time I change something in a file, and it doesn't make my development slower, so it's really fast to boot up. So I don't see a big issue, and I don't know what would be the advantage of compiling beforehand. Maybe just to share the compiled version with other parts of the code or the project. Maybe.
But we're using TypeScript.
Yeah.
I am.
So you already kind of...
Well, yeah, it's transpiling to JavaScript, but it's doing it on the fly. It transcribes the JavaScript and then runs. So, yeah.
Actually, I have two questions. How do you handle like database migrations? Because you can just file the schema on the fly, but how do you handle migration?
That's $1 million question. And the answer is I don't know, because I haven't deployed to production yet. So for development, it's very nice because it just adds new fields to the database. I don't know how it's going to work when we move to production and we have to make a change. So we probably... I was actually thinking about this, maybe detecting changes automatically and then migrating data. But that's not trivial. So it probably, the solution might have to be that you write a script and you migrate one column to another or stuff like this. So that part, I still haven't found how I can automate. But that's, from my understanding, that's the most critical thing that I haven't solved.
Okay. And also, another thing, isn't it like a burden to have to edit a 5,000 line file?
Why do you think it's a burden?
Yeah, from my experience, I prefer to work with smaller files in general.
Well, you can. I think you can separate the files if you wanted. For instance, all the stuff that's related to patients you put in one file, and then when you start the application, you just put everything together. Mm-hmm. So that would be an option, because it's just a YAML file. You can just combine and then create a new one. Maybe it's starting to get to a point where it's already too big, but I usually with just the find tool, I can find my way pretty easily. So I haven't had the urge to do that yet.
Okay.
I think there's a solution. You can have links to other documents.
In Swagger?
I think so.
Okay. Okay. So that makes it even easier.
Have you considered using a more API-oriented framework instead of using this,
Like what?
like Loopback or
Like
Loopback?
I have never heard of Loopback.
Maybe you should.
Maybe I should.
It's very interesting. So you should take a look.
Okay. And how is it different from Swagger?
It generates your endpoints for you based on your data.
Based on your what?
Data. Your model. If I remember it.
So that's even more magic.
It's even more magic.
Okay. I think I'm getting to the magic threshold, so I don't want to cross it. But I will look into it. It sounds interesting.
What was the name of it?
Look back.
Look back.
Look back. Is it very recent or not?
No.
Okay. I have to tell you that I came back from a long time of doing research in a basement to the new development world, and I haven't really developed for backend or frontend in like 5 years. And before that, I used jQuery and PHP. So I just came back out of the basement, and now there's so many solutions, and I'm not really aware of everything that's out there. So I'm just finding my way as I go. Like a year ago, I started back into this, but I'll definitely look into it.
Regarding the specification, I read some time ago, there was some companies coming together to reach a spec, or I'm
Yes.
completely wrong.
Actually, I wanted to talk about that. So Swagger really started getting popular in the enterprise, but at the same time, I think that there was a naming issue where these developers would come to the product managers and say, we want to implement Swagger. And they would think like, this is really, what, Swagger? No, we're not going to use Swagger. What kind of name is that? That must be some hipster library. So all these companies came together and they created this Open API, much more enterprise name, right? So Open API is the same thing as Swagger, from my understanding, just a different branding, and it's getting traction in the industry. So I think that all of these companies are working together on the spec, and now I wanted to mention that as well. There's a new version of the spec which is 3.0, and it came out like a month ago, and I haven't really looked at it. And I think it addresses some of the issues that I had with the limitations of the spec. This new version already addresses those. So
Are the guys, the RAM guys, also in that specification?
I have no idea.
Okay. The issue about migrations, you also you will have that problem with your clients. So that's another issue to be aware of. And that takes me to the other point, which is GraphQL from Facebook, which I think addresses the same issues of having something source of truth and generating libraries for other languages. But I've seen great things with that, so you can have versions of your API, and it will help you and alert you if you make a breaking change on your API. So if you want to
GraphQL.
yeah,
Yeah, I've heard a lot about it, but I never really looked into it. Have you used it before?
No.
Has anyone used GraphQL?
As a consumer.
As a consumer, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Just one question. I currently use Express, so I just want to understand what it replaces Swagger, well, of what I'm doing. So you have, so you do your models and your routing and all the specifications on Swagger.
Yes.
You have your app initialization on app.js, the normal file, and then the validators to confirm some of the things that the Swagger generates.
Yes.
What if you need to use another calls within that API call?
If you need to use another...
Yeah, so
Can you give
for
an example?
instance, I don't know, in your patient's case, if you're grabbing the patient and you just need to make some sort of another async call to get, I don't know, some other feed of data within that API call.
You can still do that because at the end of the day, it's your responsibility to reply to the request. And that is done in the endpoint code itself. So you get the request data, you get the result or the response data, and then you have to call the response, and you have to choose the message that you send along and the status code and all of it. So if the API reaches your code, your endpoint code, then you have to end it somehow. You have to call the response and send a 200 response or 400 or whatever you want. So otherwise it just hangs. So you have the final responsibility of handling that call. So you can make asynchronous calls all day long, wait for the responses, and then respond to the initial request.
Thank you, Miguel.
Thanks.
Thank you, Luis.